in 1943. They had some other calculating devices which were at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, which were not computers, but they were calculators, very large electronic calculators, and they knew the day was coming for a computer which could do the computations automatically, but it was not there yet. But then we were confronted with it in 1983, and we see all these computers. And
were these IBM computers?
Yes, IBM 360s and 370s, plus the hard drives, plus the tape drives, plus everything else, and one of them even had a couple of card readers there. And all of the associated hardware feeding those computers, other computers feeding them, and of course the graphic displays they used. And of course, after we got through all of that and some of the modern electronic equipment, a tour of the basement.
See, the interesting thing about that is that was the present state of technology
at
for
1983.
Everybody. Yeah, 1983, because I know IBM had just, I think, 84 announced the successor, which was the 4300 series.
Yeah, which came just a little later.
But you would think that they would have had perhaps even more advanced technology there.
They apparently didn't. Apparently they didn't in 83. An independent group had already split off from IBM, was working on the Cray computer that became a separate corporation, of course, very large.
Seymour Cray did that, right?
Yeah, and he was originally, I believe, an IBM employee, and his whole group that went with him. Mm-hmm. And they did have a Cray 1 installed at Montauk prior to 83, I think about 78, 79. That was the first of a long series. The Cray 2 didn't come along until after 83, as I remember. We did not have a Cray 2 on board. If we'd had a Cray 5 available, they wouldn't have had a problem. But we didn't.
Okay, so
they
did
showed
they
us
keep
all
you
of
in
this.
a room? Did they keep you in a room for a while, though?
They kept us in that room for a while, and we sort of looked at the equipment and so forth. Then they took us out to see other electronic equipment. They showed us... He did not show, if I remember correctly, he didn't show us the tunnel, not at first. They did later. I mean, in the first tour, there was a second tour later. But in the first tour, he didn't show us the tunnel, but they showed us some of the hardware that went along with generating the tunnel. Some of the very high-powered equipment in the basement, as it were, the huge transformer, the huge amplitrons, and a lot of the other heavy equipment.
Al, why do you
switching gear.
Why do you think they gave you the Cook's tour?
To convince us, I believe, that we were in 1983 and not in 1943, and it was not a trick, and not an illusion.
Okay, and why was it important to convince you?
I suppose one could take a number of tacks on that. They had to convince us that it was real and not illusion, so that we wouldn't think we're in some kind of a nightmare or a dream, and say, "Oh no, this isn't all real." And refused to cooperate any further because they needed our cooperation desperately.
Okay.
So eventually we were convinced, but the thing that finally convinced us was sitting down in front of large screen color TV, which of course did not exist in 43. All we had is 10-inch black and white at that time. And there were other larger experimental systems, but no color. And here we were watching color TV, and everything from the Man in the Moon to the Cold War to freeway traffic and jams in the big cities, and the status of the Cold War. Cold War, what's that? Well, we listened and watched, and we said, this doesn't fit like anything we know. And then, of course, the commercials. And the commercials are what really did it. Particularly the one, which I still think was American Airlines. It could have been any one of them. Announcing, or throwing it out into the audience, as they do in some of these commercials, on your next vacation trip to Hawaii, why not fly with us on our 747 jet? And then, of course, they show a picture of a 747 jet in flight. We look at this thing and say, huh? What's that?
I can see your jaws dropping.
Because, obviously, 747 jets or anything like it didn't exist in 43.
That's right.
The Germans had jets for the military, which they had just barely put into production, though the production versions of the ME-263, I think it was. Then there was the rocket plane, which was yet to appear in 43. But The Germans had early jets, but we had no commercial jets of any kind in 1943. No one did. So here we are suddenly introduced to a world of commercial jets. So we look at each other and says, it looks like the old man is telling it straight. So we went down to his office, looked him up, and said, okay, gentlemen, are you convinced? I said, yeah, I guess we are. He says, well, we've got a problem, and we need your help. I said, okay, what's that? He says, well, as you probably gather by now, the Eldridge was pulled out of its normal space-time location by interlocking with the Montauk project, and it's in hyperspace. And it's an artificial area, and this hyperspace bubble that it's generating is getting bigger all the time, and we don't know how large it's going to get. We don't know how long the equipment will stay on. It says theoretically it could run for 30 days until the fuel runs out on the diesels. But if nothing breaks down, it can run that long, and this bubble might get big enough to engulf the whole planet. He says, you've got to go back and shut the equipment off. I says, oh, great. And it's, how are we supposed to get back there? We don't even know how we got here.
Yeah, it's interesting, though. Was it important that you and Duncan both
Yes,
go
it was
back?
important that we both go back.
They couldn't just send somebody else?
No, it had to be us. And we didn't understand the reasoning at that point. I think von Neumann knew the reason very well. We were already part of a time loop, and we had to close it.
Okay.
So I said, well, how are we going to get there? He says, that's no problem. Montauk here, with the equipment we have complete control and mastery over space and time. We can send you any place we want at any time we want. Well, that was rather a mouthful to swallow, that they could do all of that, but they did. They gave us a tour before we were sent back. We did go up on the surface once. We did see the, shall we say, the Montauk Tunnel hardware and the point where the tunnel would manifest. It wasn't on then.
I'm gonna throw a little curveball at you right now, and then we'll get right back to that. But
okay.
If they had that ability to send you any place, any time, why couldn't they have gone to, say, the year 2000 and pulled out some nice fancy computer hardware and brought it back and used that instead of the IBM 360s?
Well, they did change them. But the point we could make there is, yes, why not? As a matter of fact, those type of techniques were used by the United States to win World War II. Mm-hmm. A very special hardware was brought in at the time of the war with Nazi Germany, because Nazi Germany was winning over us hands down.
Oh, so you think we actually did do it?
I have this on hard information.
That's interesting. We took future technology, brought it into the present, and used it to win the war. And
also certain technical equipments, i.e. special tube receivers, were designed and built in the 80s, and not the 80s, in the 70s, by Preston Nichols, who was an RF expert. Told to meet these specs, it had to be built with tubes of a vintage of 1941, 42, 43. He says, why? He says, don't ask questions, just do it. So we did. After it was tested, the piece of equipment had to go through certain specs and tests and so forth. Everything's okay. He says, all right, it's ready. But before he turned it over to his boss, he says, I don't know what's going on here, but it's something very strange. I'm putting a little piece of paper with my name and date on it inside of each one of the IF coils before I seal them up finally with their lids on them and all of this. And then they can have the receiver. We'll just wait and see what happens. Mm-hmm. I know this is a little bit of an aside, but I told him about some of those things, and he says, yes, I know. He says, one of the strange things that happened in my years of traveling around as an electronic surplus dealer and going to all these swap meets, he says, along about 79, at one of the meets up in New Hampshire, I saw a receiver that looked familiar. And he went up to it and looked at it. He said, to the guy who had it for sale, and said, where'd you get this? He says, oh, it's a standard piece of surplus equipment. And he said, the nomenclature for the nameplate for the manufacturer and the date of manufacture, the model number, all of this stuff, the whole serial numbers for the military was all on it. He looked at it and says, I think I've seen this receiver before. How much you want for it? And told him, he said, I'll buy it. He took it home, and he says to me later, he says, I swore when I saw that was the receiver I had worked on a couple of years prior in AIL in the lab and built. And it had a manufacturing date on it of 1940, with a nomenclature and nameplates for 1940, by one of the well-known manufacturers for that year, and he opens the thing up, takes the IF coil lids off, and looks down in the coils, little pieces of paper, and then pulls them out, and there's his name, and there's the date.
Wow.
From about 1978, 79, whenever it was. And a receiver which was manufactured in 1940, supposedly. Now, obviously, the model must have been sent back, it had to be sent back to the people who built it in 1940. Now, why this commerce back and forth, I don't know. But there are other examples I was cited that we literally took various materials out of the future in order to beat Hitler and beat Japan.
So you think if we did not do that, we would have lost the war?
That's the info I have, yes. Hitler was head and shoulders above us until we started feeding in certain specialized hardware and, of course, found the means to build more powerful aircraft in far greater numbers than he could possibly handle. Because we were sending 1,500 numbers of bombers in one fleet over Germany, bombing the hell out of them day and night. And there's no way the fighter craft they had, no matter how many they had, could handle wave after wave of that size.
It was amazing how quickly it was designed and built.
Yes, it was. It begs another question: how were we able to design modified B-17s and then, of course, B-29s for the Pacific primarily, but they were using B-17s, B-26s, and the British Halifax bombers over Europe at that time in such large numbers. So the British weren't building most of those, we were, and we were flying them over.
Okay.
Huge convoys, pardon the expression, not a convoy per se, but flight assemblages of flying the bombers over to England, via Greenland usually. Bottom line, we beat them, and it took some specialized approaches and hardware. We can go into that in much greater detail or more inferences, but...
Let's get to the point where they said, we need your help, you need to go back to 43.
Right. At that point, I said to him, as I had said before, I said, I don't know how you're going to do this. We don't know how we got here. And he said, we have complete control over space and time. They had given us one tour of the tunnel, not operational, past the hardware, the wall where it was installed, seeing some of the heavy equipment, and so forth. And later on, it says, I asked him, I said, how are you going to do it? He says, you've seen what we showed you about the Montauk Tunnel? He said, yes. He says, we'll ship you back through that. I says, well, how do you know where the Eldridge is? He says, we know where it is, and we know how to get you there. We'll get you there, and they did. But you're going back with radiation suits on.
Was this von Neumann?
Yes.
Who told you this?
Right.
Okay. So he seemed to sort of run the show at this point.
At this point, he did. It was his show because he knew what was coming. And even though he was only a consultant, they let him handle this aspect of it. He didn't handle much else anymore at Montauk, but that aspect he did.
So it was a radiation suit when you actually went through the tunnel?
It was not because of the tunnel. It was because of the fact we were going to go through a hyperspace field. And what they got from the way of the reports from me indicated to them that when we made the trip to 2137, we went through some hard radiation someplace in space, hyperspace, whatever it was we were in, which caused all the physical damage. We were radiation burned when we arrived in 2137. So they weren't taking any chances on it. They gave us radiation suits complete with visors, hood, gloves, everything. And I said, you want to wear these when we dump you through and put you down to the decks of the Eldridge. Says, after you're on the Eldridge, you probably won't need them. But we're taking no chances. You're going through with the suits on. When you get there, you can take them off and do what you want.
But obviously the people there in 1943, upon seeing this suit, scratched their heads saying, where the hell did that come from?
I think the guys on the deck...
well, the ones who did the investigation.
Well, that's another aspect of this.
Okay.
When we arrived back there on the deck, of course, the guys who were on the deck already, for the most part, were too far out of it to pay any attention to us. So, literally, we took off our visors and left our gloves on, found axes, and started smashing equipment, primarily the banks of 6L6s to cut the drive to the two huge alternators, because we knew if you killed that, the magnetic fields would go down, and then the whole support system for the field would collapse. We also knew it would probably take about 2 minutes before the total field was down, and we'd be back, shall we say, permanently relocated where we started from. It was during that 2-minute gap after the generators were winding down, and when everything cleared up, that we saw the sailors in the deck, the two in the bulkhead, the fifth man, and Duncan decides to go jump overboard. He jumped overboard before the fields collapsed, or it would never have happened.
Here's what I haven't figured out, though. You're down below deck when you're actually smashing all the equipment, right?
Partially. Part of it was smashed in the control room. I was on deck in the control room, and then part of it went into another room in the back of that, and then the rest of it was below deck. Mm-hmm. So we were smashing primarily the control systems, which are on deck level.
Oh, okay. And that's how you were able to see what was happening with the sailors. Okay.
And then we came back out and saw the sailors. No, we didn't climb down a ladder and come back up. We had to go down one short one into one section for other equipment to wreck it. And then we knew the alternators were down. From that, how do I say, that secondary level below the primary level of the deck, we could see the large alternators and the drive machinery equipment for it, the motor and the gearboxes. We came out and then saw the sailors buried in the deck and in the bulkhead. Duncan decides to run to the deck, across the deck and to the rail and jump overboard, looking at me as he was about to go.
So you think he panicked?
I think he panicked because of seeing Brother Jim and all these other sailors in the positions of dying.
Now, this is important. You've talked to him, obviously, quite a bit since that time, and he's admitted that he has some faint memories of the Philadelphia experiment. Did he ever tell you why he ran off?
Never asked him. Now that I think about it. I don't know if I could get him to answer that now, but the next time I see him, I'll try and ask him that.
That would be a good one to know about.
Apparently he panicked because of what he saw with the sailors and what he sensed or felt, and it was just too much for him. So he jumped overboard, he disappeared, and he went back to the future. See, if he'd waited another minute, he probably wouldn't have gone back to the future. He would have wound up in the drink. We would have fished him out of the bay water, but that didn't happen. And then, of course, the fog cleared up. They saw us. We saw the other observer ships, and then, of course, came the boarding parties, and the rest of it I've recorded. Oh, I did not mention one other aspect. After the discussion with von Neumann, and, of course, shortly after that, he was called to another aspect of his work to come up to the Los Alamos laboratories and begin the discussions on his involvement with the development of the atomic bomb.
Okay, so we're in 43?
This isn't 43. This was October 43. Probably concurrent with the third test. There was a third test of the Eldridge. They replaced all the wrecked equipment, said we'll put the ship on station, build long cables again, and remove everybody from the ship, and then run the equipment on board the ship for long cables from an adjacent ship. Late in October, one night, they did this, much further downriver, so nobody could be witness to it. There were a few witnesses on shore to that ship disappearing, and they have turned up over the years, but nobody pays any attention to them, basically. And the ship disappeared, came back about 20 minutes later, minus the cables, and when they boarded the ship, minus some of the equipment which was supposed to be operational, and some of it was on fire. So it was at that point the Navy scrapped the project. So they could clean the ship up, convert it for wartime duty, which they did. And it saw war service for a number of years until sometime in 46. In the meantime, of course, other tests were conducted elsewhere, and they were scrapped because they had the same problems. And nothing was revived until late 47. Under another code name, von Neumann was given the task to see if he could revive the project, find out what went wrong, and perhaps come up with a system that worked, which he did in 1953. But in that interim, I was sitting around, literally, in Philadelphia Navy Yard with like a bump on a log, with essentially nothing to do. Just little chores here and there.
This is October?
This was in October of 1943. Another thing that was happening at the time was that my girlfriend was pregnant. The Navy refused to allow me to see her, didn't even want me to talk with her on the phone, didn't want me to communicate with anybody off base because of this Philadelphia experiment problem. It was a very serious problem. They didn't want anybody to know how serious it was. They were afraid I would talk if I got off base or anybody else got off base. There was full restrictions on us. We were quite literally under house arrest, would be the best way to put it, on the base.
Yeah, but think how many people they would have had it done that to, because they had the three
It was
ships,
about
the carrier.
about 25.
What about the people in the carrier and the other ships?
Same thing. Anyone who witnessed what happened were in the same condition of house arrest. The captain, Harrison, probably was not. Von Neumann, of course, was not. They knew they'd keep their mouths shut because they were at a higher level of clearance, and said, I will, more than once, I will keep quiet.
So obviously then there are still a lot of people out there who have actually seen this experiment happen.
There may be a few left. I would say perhaps not over, my guesstimate now would be 3 or 4.
That's all.
That's all now, yes. But anyway, I had a pregnant girlfriend, and I said to Neumann, I says, look, I want to marry her. They won't let me off base, won't let me see her. He says, can you arrange something? He says, let me see what I can do. So Von Neumann was very helpful, and he had a lot of clout at that time, even on the Navy base. So he arranged, actually, because I did still travel back and forth from the Navy base to the Institute of Advanced Study, because we were still doing some communication and work back and forth. He finally arranged that I would be married to my wife-to-be and the chapel at the Institute, or actually on Princeton grounds. A Navy chaplain officiated, and we were married in February of 1944. Our son Jeff was born, and I remained there doing chores. So von Neumann occasionally. Finally, he asked me, would I be interested in coming up and working in Los Alamos? I said, well, what's involved? And he told me, and I said, yeah, why not? At least get out of here. So he suggested to the Navy I'd like to have me up there, that I could assist him. I knew my math very well. And he says, I need assistance on the project. And the Navy said, fine. In fact, they were very happy to get me out of Philadelphia and out of, shall we say, into an area where we were totally secluded, because Los Alamos base at that time was the most secret base in the U.S.
Now, did they give you a thorough interrogation as to what happened to you? Where did this suit come from? Those sort of things, do you recall?
No, they didn't give me a thorough interrogation about that. See, there was one suit left on the deck. That was mine. The other one remained on Duncan when he jumped overboard to go back to the future. So there was only one suit left, and they thought that was awfully strange. Mm-hmm. They didn't ask me any questions about it, and I didn't give them any answers. It's very peculiar that the story of the suit should turn up much later, decades later. Now, I'm not in a position to say who became involved with this. It was a very close friend of mine here in the Atlanta area, who at some time in his career in the past, working with the government, at one of the meetings was called in, and sitting on the table was a spacesuit, or what appeared to be a spacesuit with a visor and everything else, exactly like I've described it. And they asked him, what do you know about this suit? And he looked at it and he says, not a damn thing. What is it? He says, well, it's a radiation-proof suit and so forth. Do you know anything about it? No, I don't. He found out later it was the one that came from the deck of the Eldridge.
How in the world did he get that?
He was in very high-level clearance at that time, and he was doing work for our special agencies within the government. And why he was queried on it, I have no idea. He doesn't either. But apparently they were asking everybody for ideas, whatever the motivation was. Don't know. But in any case, I went to Los Alamos and was there from July 44 with family, and to July 4th, sometime in July 44 to July 4th of 1947. I uncovered a lot of things in the Black Vault, which I was given after the war was over full access to, because the Navy wanted me to write a classified report dealing with the development of the atomic bomb, and I had access to everything that was in that vault, which included the German records of their work on developing a bomb, where theirs came from.
So you knew all the key people?
I knew all the key people.
Wow.
Including